Thanks, Zach, and welcome everyone. Glad to have you all on board for this discussion today. I'm appreciative of the fact that we have several speakers joining us, and I will go over those in just a second. But I also want to acknowledge the fact that this particular issue is one that's very important to us as an industry. There's also obviously been work that has been done on it in the last several years, for as long as I've been at SEIA, certainly. And that, with acknowledgement that the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the power, as a whole, one of the most efficient, renewable, cost-effective sources of energy, we definitely expect there to be, a lot of deployment and a lot of growth over the next several years. In fact, in the Wood Mackenzie SEIA Solar Market Insights report, you'll have noted that, post about 2023, we expect to see an average growth of about 21% per year, which is great. And at the same time, there's recognition that, 20, 25, 30 years post installation, and when many modules are getting to end of life or end of their first service life in any case, that there will be some waste for us to deal with, or some opportunity for us to relook at how those modules could potentially be reused or materials reclaimed from them, all in an effort to get to a circular economy approach, which, from our very nascent effort for us, there's a lot to do there up and down the solar value chain in order to make that happen. But the fact that we as an industry have been proactive, and a lot of the partners that we have here on the webinar today that we'll discuss the issue with have also been very proactive in looking at the issues necessary to lead to some resolutions and some resources and solutions for each of us that participate in the industry is very good news. In particular, asset owners and EPCs, developers, also have a keen interest in it as well. They may be looking at extending, the project service lifetime by either repowering or upgrading, and they still have the critical issue of dealing with what to do with the removed panels. And so one of the things that SEIA has been active on the last several years is our National PV Recycling Program. Part of that includes the vetting of recyclers who are actually capable of taking the products through and actually recycling them or refurbishing them, potentially reselling them. There may be an opportunity to simply reuse them in the condition that they're in. And so we're also excited that we have one of our preferred partners who's going to be participating in the discussion today as well. And part of the overall effort, some of you may have heard from previous webinars, that we do operate a SEIA member-based PV recycling working group where we look at all of the different issues around the topic of recycling, reuse, and refurbishment. But essentially, that group is also providing a lot of input into what they expect from recyclers in order to actually be a preferred partner. And so that group consists of developers, owners, independent power producers, manufacturers, service providers, and many others who have an interest in the topic that are members. And of course, that provides us with a really great set of inputs into what is expected from a recycler, refurbisher, reuse or reseller. So without any more delay, I just want to go over and introduce our speakers for today that we're excited to have. We've got 3 folks joining us. The first is Suvi Sharma. He is the CEO and co-founder of SOLARCYCLE. They're a SEIA National PV Recycling Program preferred partner. Suvi was also previously the CEO of SOLARCYCLE, where he built the company from the very first days. We also have joining us John Schroeder. He's the Executive Vice President of Plant Operations and the co-founder of DEPCOM Power. They're a developer EPC and plant operations organization. John's got decades of experience with the technology and product development. So we're glad he's bringing that purview to that view to our discussion today. And then we also have Reagan Farr. He's the president and CEO and co-founder of Silicon Ranch. They are also an operations and independent power producer, developer of many, many megawatts of solar within their market. And so we're excited to have them all on board. This is going to be more conversational today. We actually don't have any slides for you all to look at, because what we want to really do is talk about the different issues that are facing each of these organizations when it comes to end-of-life management, and in their opinion, what they think is really necessary from the market perspective, the industry perspective, where they can help us identify improvements in what we do, and strategically as an industry, what we really need to bring to the table. So I do have a first question that, actually, before we get to that, I'd like to introduce, each panelist, as I've mentioned, have them come on video and really say hello and, tell us a little bit about what is of interest and exciting for you that you wanted to participate in our discussion today. So let's go ahead and start with Suvi.
Thank you, Evelyn, and SEIA for your leadership and helping to organize this webinar. I'll give a real quick background on how I got into this and my journey to solar recycling. I've been in solar industry for close to 18 years now, having co-founded two companies, SOLARCYCLE and also Nextracker. And through that, I had worked in residential and commercial and utility scale solar, seen the industry grow literally 1000x over a 18-year period, and was really quite satisfied with the role we had all played in mainstreaming solar and investing all the technology and talent and capital and materials and silicon and thin films and solar cells and panels and inverters and batteries and installation and financing and PPA and now O&M, all the sophistication. And when I took a step back, I got really interested in the circular economy, because I felt like in general, we needed to change the way we live in our society and not throw away things, but reuse and recycle them. And I thought, we in the solar industry were pretty advanced. I bet we figured this out. And when I looked deeper at the time, that this was about a year and a half ago, the pandemic was raging, couldn't travel a whole lot, but from my computer and Zoom, I literally traveled the world talking to everyone I could about what was going on in PV recycling and what were we doing in the industry to create a circular economy. And what I found was that we had not addressed this yet in the industry. It was still an afterthought, like it had been for me. We needed to develop the same technology and infrastructure and capabilities and scale to deal with the end of life as we have in making the products in the first place. And through that, what I found was that the great thing is a solar panel effectively is very recyclable. It's mostly plastic, it's mostly metals and glass, which are very recyclable. And so we have an opportunity to do this and to take these old materials out of the solar panel and figure out how we're going to make new solar panels with those materials. That's really the ultimate, to me, vision of what we want to do in the industry. And make the industry more scalable and more sustainable at the same time. And I've been thrilled by the interest in the industry to do this, and the partnership with the leaders in the industry. starting with our first partner, Sunrun, and then namely our two partners also that are on the call with Silicon Ranch and DEPCOM, who are proactively taking a leadership position to make the industry more sustainable and more circular. It takes an ecosystem to do this, and so really thrilled to be here and to talk more about this, and with a great set of leaders in the industry, with not only SEIA but also with John and Reagan here. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Suvi. Appreciate that. Good insights. John, do you want to go over a few thoughts yourself?
Absolutely. And some of my comments, I'm going to piggyback on what Suvi was saying. I've been in solar since 2005, so 18 years as well, from the module side to the developer and EPC side, and now services. And really, it was two experiences that struck me. One was that from the developer side, we kept on seeing end-of-life decommissioning plans for facilities that really just did not reflect reality, and short-term thinking. And as much as the IRA and before it the ITC are such a boon to new build and a nice incentive from an EPC and developer perspective, the asset owners make all their money in the first 5 years. And so you see almost a counter incentive to deal with end of life. So that was one experience. And the other one is, as a service provider, DEPCOM does plant restoration and major maintenance overhauls, sometimes from pretty big disasters or fires. Unfortunately, these plants do catch on fire from time to time. And I would just see over time and time again, people who would normally be very much a champion of social governance and good recycling, that when it came down to the dollars, the insurance company or the owner would just be more than happy to throw the modules in a landfill. And that was really disheartening for me, very discouraging. And so not just because it's the right thing to do, but I really don't think our industry survives the headline that gigawatts upon gigawatts of modules end up in landfills. That's just not sustainable on so many different levels. So happy to try to be part of the solution, to partner with businesses like SOLARCYCLE, and to partner with policy influencers and trade associations like SEIA to see if we can change our culture a little bit, change either from a policy perspective or just what we're willing to do. So that's why I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, John. That's awesome. Last but not least, Reagan, how about you go ahead and come on camera and introduce yourself as well?
Evelyn, thank you, and appreciate the opportunity to speak on this topic. Want to thank Suvi especially for taking a lead and being part of the solution to an issue that I think this industry is going to face at scale in the years to come. Silicon Ranch, I'm one of the 3 co-founders. I came out of state government. I was Tennessee's Commissioner of Revenue. My fellow co-founders were a former 2-time governor and economic development commissioner. And when we founded Silicon Ranch, it's a Nashville-based company. Solar was completely nascent in the part of the world where we established the company. So we were we were a pioneer as we rolled out solar plants in the southeastern part of the US. And we always viewed this as a tremendous opportunity for communities to experience positive externalities related to the energy transition. Historically, we've put our energy plants that had negative externalities in communities, and we've all reaped the benefit of low cost fossil-based power, but not always borne the cost of the negative pollution and particulates from those plants. So we've taken a long-term view of this industry, and we're a long-term developer, owner, operator. We've owned and operate over almost 2.5 gigawatts of plants. We've never sold a plant, and we like to own the real estate where we build our plants and become very embedded in the communities. And it's interesting, I think, you know, when we first started, it was all about deployment, and you start learning these lessons as you go through the process. And one of my first lessons was I always thought of vegetation as a liability, and tried to manage my vegetation with herbicides, pesticides, mechanical mowing, and ended up through a series of interactions and experience totally transitioning the way our company viewed land and vegetation. And we started viewing it as an asset, and have built a whole program around regenerative land management and dual use of our solar arrays. And I'm very excited about this. And I think a similar mind shift needs to happen in the industry around modules that are past their useful life, or that are, you know, our oldest plants are 10 years old and they're operating very well, but we have had a whole lot of warranty claims. And for those modules, I didn't know what to do with them. There's not a clear end use for them. So I would just store them on our site. So I was very excited. We had entered into recycling with First Solar for those modules, but didn't have a good solution for all of our silicon-based modules. So when SOLARCYCLE rolled out, we were very eager to sign up with them. I have already used their services. And I think our industry, you know, I always, when I see Abby and she puts all these charts up of the growth of solar and what the IRA is going to empower, I always say, you know, the IRA didn't deal with the two biggest challenges that I think the industry faces. And one is our social license to operate and continue to be accepted in communities where we want to build plants. And a lot of the pushback that we're seeing, some of it is very legitimately driven by this industry needs to comport itself in a way that we're going to be good long-term partners. And a big part of that is how we deal with end of use and waste streams from our facility. So I think SOLARCYCLE plays a very important pioneering role. And I think all of us as industry participants need to line up and support this until it scales. And then I think it will become self-sustaining. But right now it needs to be holding ourselves accountable and playing a role in helping renewables become a more circular industry.
That's great. Thanks, Reagan. And definitely agree and acknowledge that the work that we have ahead of us in terms of a more environmental, social responsibility perspective is quite a bit of a body of work. This particular area gets us, you know, to acknowledge the necessity from a very, you know, bare materials perspective, but there's certainly much, much more that we need to address. And it's great to hear that Silicon Ranch is making strides and has a much different perspective in terms of, you know, respect for the community in which your projects are located. So I'm going to turn to a couple of questions for each of our panelists then today. And I'd love to start with Suvi, obviously, mainly because John Reagan have mentioned a few times some great opportunities in working with you, Suvi, and SOLARCYCLE. So if you don't mind coming on video. Certainly we started conversations with you all quite some time ago. I was actually trying to remember the first time you and I spoke, but it was probably more than a year and a half ago. And so to see the organization come to fruition is fantastic. And you've all grown very quickly and very well since your launch in the last year. I know that I've seen, and I was just actually on a meeting earlier today with some of the folks, the stakeholders in the state of Illinois, with one of your team actually talked about the fact that you're able to recycle 95% of the value of the materials that come to you. And so maybe to kind of ground everyone in what you all are able to do, could you give us a description of your recycling and reuse process or the operations there? So we have a better idea of how you're meeting those, you know, high penetration goals.
Sure, absolutely, Evelyn. So first of all, in terms of the recycling of solar, the first step is the logistics piece. That's a very important piece because, as we all know, solar panels are big, bulky. They're often in hard to reach places in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes they're in urban areas, but they're all over, and they're in residential and commercial and utility applications. So we've worked a lot in the last year to optimize how do we get these panels from wherever they are today. Sometimes they're installed on the ground. Sometimes they're in a warehouse. They can be in various places in different volumes and in different formats. And so a lot of the work has been, how do we package these properly? How do we transport them? How do we maximize the amount of panels in trucks? Because that not only saves cost, but that also lowers the carbon footprint of the transportation process. So really, that's one of the areas that we invested pretty quickly in and hired some key talent in. One of the first, for example, executives I hired, Joan Han, she's our VP of Global Logistics, which normally you don't, first you develop your product and then you figure out how to ship it, but we had to go the opposite way. And so we've done a lot of work, and that's still a work in process to really get that perfected. But for example, we've been able to transport more panels in trucks than I've ever done before when we were shipping new panels. So there's some opportunities there to optimize, to innovate. That's the first step is logistics management and optimization around how we pick up these panels and what format and where. And we've been working on that. What we did is we set up our first recycling facility in Odessa, Texas, right in the heart of the Permian Basin, the largest oil and gas deposits in the country. But it was a good place. It's pretty central. Both Texas is very large state for solar now, but also we can reach California, we can reach the Southeast and the Northeast. And it was a good first place to set up. Over time, we'll need to set these facilities up in a few other regions to be closer to the projects where the bulk of the panels are installed, but it was a good place. And also we saw in our proximity a lot of unfortunately damaged panels from weather events in Texas in particular. And so these early volumes, while it's as a solar person, it's heartbreaking to see, but that's the kind of volumes we need to Reagan and John were saying, we need to scale up the recycling operation to drive the cost down and make it more and more self-sustaining from just the material extraction that we're doing. Now, what we focused on, I had spent many years developing solar panels, new processes to make solar panels, better ways to make them more efficient. So I thought, let's try to use some of that same capability, even some of the same people, to reverse engineer this and to demanufacture these panels. What is the proper way we can extract at a high volume the materials out and unmanufacture a solar panel? And so we very quickly, we did mobilize very quickly. The company is just about a year old, but we mobilized quickly, and because of our knowledge and experience and having worked in the solar industry, we could find the technical capabilities to start developing an equipment set that is very, very specialized. So because I visited other recycling facilities, particularly electronics waste and electronics recycling operations. And what I saw was that they were using equipment that could shred a keyboard or it could shred a monitor to try and recycle a solar panel. And that just was putting a square peg in a round hole. And we realized that we needed to develop very specific equipment, and that the volumes we were starting to see were growing rapidly enough that it warranted that. And so we took, what we did is we looked at several industries, solar industry, the mining industries, and the electronics waste industries, and what equipments they were using to do different parts of the process of extraction and separation. And we then developed a whole custom equipment set and line to do this, where solar panels go in. It starts out very mechanical, and then eventually electrical, and then finally chemical process to separate all this out. And our focus is zero waste in the process, so getting every single material out in the process. Not all of them are valuable materials, by the way. Most of them have value, But certain things like plastic, like the EVA and the back sheets, in reality today, there's not much value there. But we still want to extract it and put it back into the manufacturing chain so that there's a use for it. But the materials that are valuable are things like aluminum, silver, copper, and also what we see value in the silicon and the glass as well. And so we have a mechanical process that separates the frames out. This is all automated. So the key to driving scale and up and cost down is automation. And so most of the people we have are really in the materials movement part of the equation, where there's panels being moved or materials being moved. But we deframe the panel, remove the junction box, all with equipment and automation, and then we remove the glass. We care a lot about the glass. I could literally spend the rest of the webinar on what I've learned about glass and how important glass is, but I won't do that. I'll save that for another session. But solar glass, by weight, a solar panel is 70 to 90% glass, depending on if it's a glass backsheet or a glass module. So it's very important to get that glass. And we remove that glass. We have two different machines to do that. If the glass is intact, we have one machine. If the glass is broken, we have a different machine. But we always want to remove that glass, get that glass. Solar glass is low iron glass. It's a very specialized material mix that hardly any of that exists in the US today, that raw material. So getting this glass out is going to be very important to formulate into new solar glass in the future to make new solar panels with and create that domestic industry with what we're doing. And then the rest of it is plastic and metals. It's what's inside behind the sandwich in the glass. We then crush and shred all that into granulated material and separate out the metal from the plastic. And the plastic, as I mentioned, we are working on. We haven't finalized the use case, but we have some promising work going on with some big materials companies to use that plastic. And then we have electrostatic type separation that separates all the metals, which is the silver, the silicon, the copper, some tin and lead, into a mixture of metals. We're able to do that, all of that today, what I described in Odessa, Texas. We just started up the line, though, at the end of last year because we had to spend 2022 developing that equipment set. So, I like to say there's a crawl, walk, run phase whenever you do new manufacturing. We're in the crawl phase. We're working to get to the walk phase by March, and by April into the run phase where we're really running this. And we've set up capacity there to do nearly about 500,000 panels a year and process them. Finally, the last step is the final metal mix. We can sell those metals to companies that will refine it or smelt it themselves. But our focus is to do all of that in-house. And so we have R&D that we've been doing. We will have commercial operations for this by Q3 of this year, where we will separate out all the metals ourselves in that facility in Odessa, Texas, the silver, the silicon, the copper, the tin, and the lead. We have proven that we've been able to do it at a small pilot scale already. But now we're working to develop a commercial grade machine that can do about 1 million panel a year capacity in Odessa, Texas, in the second half of the year. So that's the process. And then finally, as we get all these materials out, we need to find homes for them. We need to, it's not just extracting the materials, but it's finding the off-takers for those materials that can use those materials into new products. And we've been able to find users for all of that, off-takers for all that, except for the plastics, which we're working to finalize right now. But one thing I would like to just end this question with is at our focus, because we're solar people, I like to say we're a solar company that does recycling. We're not a recycling company that does solar. And I am deeply committed to the solar industry and to scaling the industry and to make it better and better and to be a leader. If we can do what we're trying to do right, I believe we can make solar not only circular, but the most circular industry in the world. I think we can do that both because of the nature of the product and the nature of the companies that are involved in it, which are really focused on driving scale and sustainability, such as the folks here on the call with me. And so as part of that, we not only want to extract the materials and get value out of them, but we want to create value. Like, for example, the glass, it's not good enough for us to take the glass, sell it to somewhere where it goes into bottles. We want to make solar glass out of that. We want to make new solar panels out of that glass. That takes work. That takes R&D because that's not done today. And so that is what we feel like is our job, and what we are working with our partners early on is to drive that ecosystem to finally create value, not just extract value out of the recycling process. And that commitment to the technology and the investments that we're going to make. That hopefully is what can really at the end create a better industry, and we need partners to do that. You know, as Reagan and John mentioned, they've partnered with us early because we need early partners who are supporting this, because right now the cost to recycle is high, but we're going to drive that down so that really over time most of the value we'll be getting and revenue we'll be getting is from the materials themselves, not from the recycling fees that we charge.
Gotcha. Thanks, Suvi. Appreciate that overview. And I know we've got a few questions in the chat that we will definitely get to, but I think you also were able to answer a couple of them. But we'll come back to those so that we can also get some insight from Reagan and John. So real quick, I want to move to Reagan. So with what Suvi's mentioned about, you know, their ability to, in an innovative way, take a much broader retrospective of the benefits of recycling, how would you highlight that in terms of impact benefits, you know, for the communities you work with, you know, the industry in general? You mentioned a little bit about that earlier in your intro, but, you know, keeping, you know, obviously if we're recycling modules, you know, and we're chipping away at getting towards a much more effective circular economy, but that means we're keeping modules out of landfills, right? Which is really, really important. So tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. So one thing that I think the industry needs to address, and we've seen it not so much in solar. Solar is not a mature enough industry, but you're seeing it play out with wind. A lot of the early wind projects were developed by companies that aren't around anymore. Mm-hmm. And farmers and other landowners sign lease deals with these companies. And now they're stuck with a large piece of infrastructure on their land that they didn't reserve capital. They don't know where to go to get it decommissioned. And windmills aren't easily recyclable. There's a lot of material that needs to be addressed. So you're seeing very sophisticated groups like the Farm Bureau and local communities come out and say, we need standards, we need to hold these renewable industries accountable, because so much of the development of solar is on leased property. So more and more you're seeing dialogues at a national level around reclamation bonds and how are we going to make sure that you're being responsible with the end of life of these renewable energy facilities. So rather than have that dictated down, I think the industry needs to really come together and say, we don't want to meet some bare minimum standard. And I think John kind of alluded to that. He saw some of that in his role at DEPCOM. I think the industry needs to say, we're going to create a new standard for how we look at these assets throughout their complete life cycle. And putting these modules, they're bulky. Putting them in landfills is not the right answer for what we need to be doing. We're trying to bring, you know, we very much focus on when we invest in these communities, we want to make them better because we're there. And that doesn't mean we're filling up their landfill with e-waste. So from the beginning, you know, when we signed our large module agreements with First Solar, we made sure we had end-of-life recycling in there, and we didn't have that option for non-First Solar modules. And we have had a volume of warranty claim modules, you know, some with weather, but some just candidly with warranty issues, and you can get them replaced. But then, you know, the original manufacturers, they don't want them back. So you have to ask yourself, what do you do with them? And landfilling them is the easy thing. It's the least expensive thing today. There is probably a slight premium, and we should acknowledge that, to recycling today. But if we're not willing to commit to that as an industry, so that companies like SOLARCYCLE can scale, it's always going to be a premium, and not everybody's going to do that best practice. So I think we need to commit ourselves to being an industry that has the moral high ground when we are asking for, our asset class is going to take millions and millions of acres of land. And, you're going to be taking land that was formerly in forest, that was some of it's brownfield, and that's great, but a lot of it's going to be formerly ag land. And we're going to have to say why we should dedicate this land to this type of energy production. And we really need to, I think, be in the lead in terms of we are a net positive, and we have thought through everything, not just those first 5 years that John referenced, but the full life cycle, and that we can be the most circular industry out there. We're so well situated to do that if we make the right decisions today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Reagan. That, very many great points there. And certainly, the utilization of policy as an enabler to help us avoid landfilling is definitely something we should consider. I think the great thing is that there are now options other than landfilling that we can take advantage of, like recycling. And certainly, organizations like SOLARCYCLE will help us get there. So, definitely we're still at the infancy of that, but it may be at some point in time that we look at making a much more, proactive support for, landfilling not be as easy as an option or as economic of an option if we really do want to make those commitments, and I think we do. So I want to get some insight from John as well as an asset owner. When you look at extending, project lifetime, we've talked about, the fact that end of life management, there might be at the end of the first useful lifetime, or if there's an opportunity to extend beyond kind of the initial period of expectation. How are asset owners, John, looking at trying to extend that longevity? And at the same time, how are you proactively, planning and looking at how you mitigate, potential and actual damage from some of these extreme weather events that Suvi mentioned come your way?
Thanks, Evelyn, for the question. Judging by the panelist questions in the chat room, everyone wants to know about modular recycling. So I'm going to keep my response very brief. I would say primarily long-term thinking. That's the theme that you'll hear from me throughout this webinar, is a change towards long-term thinking. So what asset owners are doing is they're thinking about the reliability of the equipment that they start with in the first place. If you're just thinking about the first 2 years, or you're planning on flipping the project at commercial operation, you're not going to have that sort of mentality. And so encouraging long-term thinking, like Silicon Ranch does, long-term ownership. Second thing they're looking at is enhanced service providers. They're looking at O&Ms that just aren't going to, check how things are, but people who can really keep equipment running, even if the manufacturer is long gone, if the parts aren't made. We sometimes use the phrase, with sticks and bubble gum, I can get this thing running again. That type of advanced capability maintenance provider really helps as well. And then lastly, and this is more pie in the sky, very aspirational, but I think there's a little bit of a movement to get into backwards compatibility. So one of the biggest problems in trying to make these assets last 30 to 40 years is if you do have an extreme weather event or a disaster, the new stuff doesn't work with the old stuff. And so you get a rip and replace cost that is tremendously high. And if things are designed a little bit more with that in mind, not from the equipment standpoint, but also the plant itself, where one module can be swapped out for another module, or at least the asset owner is thinking about that ahead of time. And so they're getting things that aren't so unique, where and they're built in such a way where they can actually be maintained, actually be upgraded, or best would be if we could one day reach backwards compatibility with equipment. So Yeah, long-term
Yeah.
thinking. Like I said, I'm
Yeah.
trying to keep my response a little brief, just
Yeah.
because
No, it's
when
all
we get
good.
back to recycling.
Yeah, it's all good. No, thank you. I think that's important because, as part of what's considered a robust circular economy, right? We need to look at all of the different disposition channels, right? Obviously, lengthening the time of operation that a project is actually able to go, farther than expected. Maybe there are some of the things that you're talking about, in terms of, the equipment addressing, the upgrades. But, certainly 30 years later, you're not going to find the same module that you purchased when you first built the project. So that's definitely a great consideration from a design perspective. So I have actually a question for everyone, if you all don't mind coming on screen, and feel free to jump in and answer, as you like. But, so from SEIA's perspective, we have been working on, just one piece of trying to get at, again, that circular economy approach. And our initiative at first was, particularly for many of our members, was the simple approach of finding recyclers who can actually process the material. Many of them had, warranty returns, or they had manufacturing scrap, or they had damaged product that, they needed to dispose of, and they didn't want to go the landfill route. And so our approach was, very specific, right, in seeking out recyclers. But given what you've all been saying about the other things that industry could be doing, what are your ideas about how we can address some of those other aspects of what a circular economy could bring for solar? Obviously there's a big world there from what that means, everything from, reuse, material reclamation, John mentioned, extended operations, level up skills of some of the technicians there. But what other things do you think are tools for us for getting at that? Ideas about maybe education or policy or other kind of on the ground types of things that we could help initiate. So yeah, I'd love for you all to come on screen and maybe give me some of your thoughts, since you have different pieces in the value chain that you're participating in.
Looks like I'm first. Regan, I beat you to the camera being on. So I would do two things in our industry. First and foremost, end of life decommissioning plans for facilities. I think that we should require as an industry for those to be certified in some way, shape, or form, whether that be with a professional engineer or somebody with a, leads or a government entity, some form of certification that those would require, so that it's not this ridiculous, in 30 years, everything that's here will be sold off and that will cover all the cost of decommissioning. And so the decommissioning cost is zero type of plans. The second thing, and I'll say that just in full disclosure, I did work for First Solar for 7 years. First Solar used to sell a recycling bond with every single module, so that even if they weren't in business at the end of life of that module, it would be recycled by someone. There was what they called a pre-funded recycling program. And I thought that was very good from a responsibility perspective. The issue was, if you looked at the value chain of solar, there was a premium then they had to put on top of their module. And when they did some market testing, the customers would rather not pay upfront to have the modules recycled. And I think that should come back. I think, we had this nice Inflation Reduction Act get passed. And as many of you on the call know, The ITC has kickers. You know, you could get 30%, but then if you get domestic content, there's a 10% kicker. If it's energy community, 10% kicker, and so on. So I think it would be really strong if it said, hey, every module that gets installed in this country has to come with a pre-funded recycling bond. And I'm not just doing that because I'd like to invest in Suvi's business. I honestly think that that's just the right thing to do. And I think that then the end of life decommissioning budgets for these facilities could be a lot more realistic, because at least the modules are already taken care of with that bond and with that regulatory signal from the government. You know, if we don't want to do it that way, I'm sure there's other ones. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. That's just one idea on how to do it. But somehow I think we need to compel that that this is something that the whole industry needs, not by manufacturer or by owner, but as a whole, 100% of them, that it happens that way.
Got you. So definitely something in the financial, you know, I don't know if assurance is the right word, but a financial mechanism to ensure that the costs can be borne appropriately, right? So Reagan, go for it.
Yeah, so one just comment on John's, you know, the solar industry, at least today, doesn't lend itself well. I'm very familiar with that first solar product, and it is a premium product. Just like today, recycling is a premium product to landfilling modules. And because different players in our space play only certain roles, I feel like Silicon Ranch and a handful of others are unique in that we develop, build, own, and operate for the long term. So we're incented to take that long-term view. But if I'm just developing to sell, I'm not going to be, that project's not going to be mine, you know, 1 year from now, much less 40 years from now, when you're really considering the decommissioning. So some alignment of, or some type of product, because you have a lot of responsible energy buyers, like all of the hyperscalers that are driving the energy transition. They don't want to be affiliated with, you know, buying electrons off of plants that aren't responsible. So some type of seal of approval that you could say this plant is running with a commitment to recycle. I think that would be something interesting that SEIA could do. I also think, you know, when we did our, we knew Suvi, my team knew him well, and we were very comfortable signing on, being one of their first commercial scale customers. But we also, when we did our first batch of recycling, followed the full cycle. You know, I sent my team to their plant in Texas. They watched and learned watching the modules go through the recycling process. And I will say, I get inbounds all the time from quote unquote recycling companies. And, you know, they're much less expensive. And I have a whole lot, you know, I don't even return most of the calls, but there's a lot of, you know, you can say you're selling to a recycler, but unless you follow the true chain of custody to know that those modules are actually getting recycled, that's just one more area. So one thing SEIA could do that's relatively, in my mind, kind of right in y'all's fairway is kind of the SEIA good housekeeping stamp of approval, so that you have said, we have vetted at some level these solar recycling companies, and they do indeed recycle the modules. And I think it's great, you know, Suvi threw that percentage out, 95%. What does recycling mean? Does that mean you're just taking the aluminum? Because that's the easy button for a lot of the recycling, and then you're landfilling the rest. So I think SEIA is uniquely situated to kind of put their stamp of approval and do some pre-vetting that not everybody is in a position to do themselves.
Thanks. I think it's definitely interesting suggestion, and beyond what we do today to physically, you know, vet the operations of the recyclers, but to look at, you know, truly with what they're doing, you know, operationally, and see if there's a way to, you value that in a way that can be better understood by the customers, right? That's a really interesting suggestion, and one that I definitely wrote down. Suvi, do you want to come online and tell us a little bit about what you think? I know we're heading towards
yeah, I'll try to
end of our
answer
hour.
it quickly. There's a lot of actually really great questions
Yes,
here that we're not going to be
exactly.
able to get to on this. I do want to talk about how maybe we can address those offline or whatever, but
Sure, we can. We will.
okay. I think if two things, I could, there could be like 100 things here on how to drive circularity. If I just focus on two things, one very like ground level, one very high level. On the high level, I think a pull from the big asset owners, IPPs, developers to use recycled content in the hardware that they're deploying, the modules that they're deploying. We are starting to see interest on this, by the way. So today there is no metric like that, but I think we can get
Correct.
there. And again, it's not that demand it today, right? Because it's going to take time, but it's like, hey, let's set a roadmap where, eventually the panels we're deploying 4 or 5 years from now have 50% recycled content, as an example. I think that's very doable and attainable. And that requires a lot of things to happen in between now and then, but it's a large force mechanism to do that. So that's the high level thing. I think on the tactical ground thing is, at the end of the day, it's people that make the difference. And what we found is that a lot of companies, they realize we should do recycling. They even enter into agreements with us, but they don't have someone on their team whose job it really is to do management of these quote unquote end of life assets, and put a standard operating procedure there of how they're going to deal with it. So this is where the rubber hits the road of who's responsible for this, how are they measuring it, so on. So I think just like everything else, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. I think if we can have, and we started talking to partners about this, how can they measure this? And we try to do a lot of reporting on what we do in the facility, what kind of landfill is avoided, what metals are extracted, where is it sold, and so on. What's the greenhouse gas benefits? But driving those into the standard operating procedures of companies, because it's a new thing. It's not something that companies have had to deal with. That's going to be very important. That's going to create that groundswell of actual activity to recycle these, and these not end up in landfills, because even though there's a good sort of top-down view of we should recycle, but it's not filtering down into how the company does business and transacts on a day-to-day basis.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. Good points. And I like how you did a high level and on the ground. I think that's important because, certainly, the strategy and kind of the overall goals, needs to be translated in an operational way, right? For people to know, what do I do differently? Like, what do I actually do differently tomorrow? And is there a guide, or is there some help to help me get there? So I know I'm going to go through, and what I want to reassure folks, and I appreciate you putting your questions in the chat. As Zach mentioned, you're going to get a copy of a link to the recording, and any questions we don't get to, we will answer and make sure that's also available to you. So as I kind of scroll through here, I did mention a PV working group. Our current PV recycling working group is a member-based group. So if you're a member of SEIA, just reach out to your membership manager, or I'm going to put my email in the chat here so that you can reach out to me and we can get you connected to that to participate. If you are not a SEIA member, but you're interested in participating in another, national, more broader stakeholder type of group, also please email me. We've got something like that being planned and underway. We get you connected to the folks that are helping us facilitate that. I think this question, Suvi, one of the questions was how you calculated your 95% of the value of the materials. And I don't know if you want to quickly address that, but I think you described it in terms of the fact that some of the smallest things that you're focused on recovering are actually the largest in value. And that's how you calculated that, like the silver,
Yes.
the copper.
Yeah, the way we calculate that is we look at what the value of the materials in the panel are from companies that purchase recycled materials to put back in the manufacturing chain, and what amount we can collect and then have off takers on. Most of the value from a value standpoint, economic standpoint, is in the silver in the laminate, the aluminum frame, and the copper that's contained in the panel. Those are those are materials that can be, essentially, if you extract them, can be easily sold. And then things like glass, which are very bulky in terms of mass or the majority, there's actually not that much value in them, even though we do extract, that counts towards it. But when we look at 95%, it's of all the, basically it's all the metals. There's finally the only thing we are not able to extract full value out of is there's some residual metals that get combined with the plastics in there. And 95% is conservative. Our real aim inside the company is, how do we get to 99%? But that's what we feel confident in being able to quote unquote market out there. But it's based on really getting all the metals except for some final small amount of metals that's left in the plastics.
Awesome, thanks. And I want to touch upon this question because you also kind of mentioned it a little bit as well when we talk about, recycled content. And maybe, I don't know, Reagan and John, if you also have an opinion on this, but there was a question about would we need legislation in order to incentivize, right, developers, owners, EPCs, at some point in time, whether it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, to utilize modules that have a certain amount of recycled content or reclaimed materials? Or is that something that you think, from your perspectives, you would be proactive to use if it were available to you?
I gave John a chance and he didn't ring in. I think data transparency would be helpful initially, maybe even more so than legislation. This industry is being driven by companies who are committed to RE100, and everyone's trying now to say we're not just looking at renewable energy, we're looking at our carbon footprint. So I think if you set out a standard and make it clear that here's a level of commitment to doing the right thing, that eventually the market will react to that, because it's the right thing to do. And I think that will probably be easier than trying to push such a targeted piece of legislation through the process. Absolutely.
It's kind of like looking at many consumer-based products where, the attractiveness of using recycled materials or material content is something that is, very much driven by their own need and desire for it. So we are at the top of our hour, and I again want to thank and acknowledge the participation of all of our panelists here, Suvi, Reagan, and John. Really very much appreciate all of your insights. I know that we didn't get to a lot of the questions and comments, but we will save those and work with our panelists here to get answers to that, so that'll be available to you with the recording link. Any questions, feel free to reach out to SEIA, either at membership@seia.org or myself. I put my name and my email in the chat, and so look forward to hearing from you. And thank you again for attending the webinar.
Thank you, Evelyn.
You're welcome.